Jason started cutting the fence of the enclosure of Sombra. He and a group of animal rights activists planned to liberate Sombra from her enclosure. In the middle of the night, they made their way to her. They were prepared to defy the authorities to give Sombra the freedom they believed she deserved. As they approached Sombra's enclosure, their hearts raced with anticipation. They expected Sombra to be relieved. Instead, something else happened. They were trespassing, so they couldn't risk getting caught or they would be in a cell just like Sombra. They could hear a slight hum as they approached a cage from behind. They couldn't immediately see what was inside, but they just hoped it was Sombra. They had already passed 3 other cages with sleeping lions in them, and if one of them had woken up, they would have definitely made it known to the caregivers by loudly roaring. Step by step, they approached the cage. Finally, when they stood in front of it and saw it was Sombra who was sleeping inside, they could quietly sigh in relief. But the job wasn't done just yet. They still had to figure out a way to free Sombra without waking up all the other animals. And there was one more thing they had to be worried about. Sombra was still a wild animal. What if she became aggressive and charged at Tom and Jason? It was a very dangerous situation, and Jason was very aware of that. But before we start, smash the like button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. They crouched down by the cage door and put their backpacks on the ground. Slowly, they zipped them open, trying not to make a sound. They reached their hands into their backpacks and slowly took out their tools. They had brought a crowbar and a big pair of bolt cutters to cut open the cage and Sombra's chain. They placed the tools in front of them and paused for a second. Tom gave Jason a look of, "Are we really doing this?" And Jason just sighed and looked at Sombra. They sat there for a minute and then it was time to get to work. They knew exactly what to do because they had practiced this moment a few days before. Tom and Jason stood, stiffened with terror. They slowly turned their heads to look around the room and noticed how all the other animals were facing them. They were growling softly and breathing very hard at the same time. Tom and Jason knew they had to hurry because the animals were unpredictable. They could suddenly start roaring very loudly, notifying the caregivers something was wrong. They looked back at Sombra and realized she was still lying on the ground, even though her cage door was fully opened. They figured she could be chained very tightly, so they slowly made their way into the cage and stopped as soon as they were crouching down next to Sombra. It was remarkable how calm she was, and Jason and Tom were a little confused by it. They had thought she would be excited and all over the place, trying to break free from her chain to run out of her cage, but she almost seemed a bit unbothered by the whole event. She just sighed very loudly and closed her eyes again to get back to sleep. Jason frowned and looked at Tom, who raised his shoulders in return. Should they keep going? The sound of Sombra's chain falling to the ground triggered another wave of growl echoing through the room, but this time it wasn't so quiet. One of the lions began to roar and even charged at his cage. Tom and Jason fell back onto the ground in shock and hissed at Sombra to make a move, but she refused. She just laid there, not moving an inch. They decided to keep going. Maybe Sombra wasn't realizing it yet, but she sure would as soon as she was freed from her chain. What would happen after Sombra was freed from her cage was still a question for Jason and Tom. Her cage was located inside a room at the back of the Wildcat Sanctuary, so they would have to think of a way to get her through the back door without anyone noticing. There were cameras everywhere, but they just figured if they had managed to get in, they would manage to get out. The sound of Sombra's chain falling to the ground triggered another wave of growl echoing through the room, but this time it wasn't so quiet. One of the lions began to roar and even charged at his cage. Tom and Jason fell back onto the ground in shock and hissed at Sombra to make a move, but she refused. Jason tried to push Sombra from behind in order to move her out of the cage, but instead of standing up, she turned her head backward and growled at Jason. It was an aggressive growl, one that doesn't have to be repeated, as she would be biting on your arm by then. Jason immediately stopped and looked at Tom with tears in his eyes. The barely audible hum from the outside combined with the menacing growls from the big cats. each resonating like a ghostly serenade. Tom leaned closer to Jason, their faces mere inches apart, trying to relay a plan. "We need to think quickly." Each time one growled or shifted, both men froze, the risk of detection a constant threat. Their whispered strategy session was like trying to converse during a haunting lullaby. Tom, ever the pillar of strength, placed a reassuring hand on Jason's shoulder. "We came here with a purpose, and we can't lose sight of that now," he urged. There had to be a way to reach Sombra, to make her understand. Tom's thoughts drifted back to their research, their attempt to understand pumas, and the possibility that Sombra had formed a bond with her surroundings. Perhaps they'd misunderstood her reality. Jason and Tom knew they had to proceed with caution. Tom retrieved a small packet of meat from his backpack, hoping to appeal to Sombra's instincts. He held it out carefully, inching closer, but Sombra merely glanced at it before locking eyes with Tom, unmoving. Suddenly, distant footsteps echoed, staff returning. Their hearts raced as they realized the weight of being caught. Searching for an exit, they stumbled upon a storeroom filled with tranquilizer darts and guns. The realization hit hard. This place wasn't just a refuge. They'd been sedating them, Tom muttered, bitterness in his tone. They now faced a moral crossroad. Sedating Sombra could allow them to free her, but at a cost. Jason hesitated, questioning if this was truly the path they intended. Jason gave a reluctant nod. "All right, but we need to be careful." Tom loaded a dart into the tranquilizer gun, hands trembling. Taking aim, he prayed it would work. The dart struck Sombra softly. She flinched, then her body began to relax. With time running out, Tom and Jason moved quickly. The tranquilizer's effect would be short-lived. They observed Sombra's calm, rhythmic breathing, knowing their moment of action had arrived. Tom and Jason worked swiftly to unfasten the restraints on Sombra's cage. Each second intensified the storm of sound, every move agitating the sanctuary's residents further. The serenity of the space had vanished, replaced by a turbulent outcry. The Puma lay still, unaware of the growing unrest her sedation had caused. Tom's fingers closed around the final chain link that held Sombra prisoner. Cold and unyielding, it resisted their every effort. Jason joined him, and together they wrestled with the metal, their hands slick with sweat and desperation. Their triumph was short-lived. A piercing alarm shattered the silence. They'd been discovered. Now, escaping with Sombra became their next challenge. Her weight and sedated state made transport nearly impossible, but they pressed on. The sanctuary's once muted corridors were now alive with urgency. Footsteps approached. Tom and Jason ducked behind a large enclosure, crouching low as shadows danced on the walls. Through a gap, they spotted the caretakers sweeping the area. Their expressions were stern, a blend of shock and fury. But their cover didn't last. A noise, a jostled cage or misplaced step, betrayed them. Lights flooded the area, exposing their hiding spot. With no choice, Tom and Jason raised their hands in surrender, hearts heavy with uncertainty. "Please, let us explain," Tom pleaded, emotion in his voice. For a moment, the air remained tense. Then, a senior caretaker stepped forward, calm but firm. "Speak," he said, offering a chance to be heard. Tom and Jason recounted everything, their intentions, fears, and what had driven them to act. The caretakers listened, then shared their own side, stories of care, protection, and unwavering dedication to the animals. Their words painted a different picture. Sombra hadn't been a captive, but a survivor. Injured and alone as a cub, she had been nurtured by this very team. "She was more than an animal to us," one caretaker shared, voice thick with emotion. Tom and Jason began to see what they had missed. In their rush to save Sombra, they'd ignored the deep bond she had with those around her. Her seeming indifference earlier had not been apathy, it had been belonging. "We're here to protect them," the senior caretaker said, "to give them a life they wouldn't have otherwise." The words struck a chord. Regret settled over Tom and Jason like a heavy fog. Their eyes, once filled with fiery conviction, now shimmered with humility. They had meant well, but had acted blindly. Tom whispered, "What have we done?" as Jason stood silently, the weight of realization sinking in. They knew they had to change, not just their tactics, but their entire approach. "We need to do better," Jason said. "Learn before we act." With respect, they turned to the caretakers. "Your dedication is inspiring," Tom admitted. Their misunderstanding had given way to admiration. Before departing, they made a vow. "We'll tell others the truth about sanctuaries like this. We'll be better advocates." Their journey wasn't over. It had just taken a different path. What they once saw as confinement now stood as a beacon of care and conservation. And as they left, it was with a renewed sense of purpose.